Hey, Ivan.
Hi. Yeah, add that last minute PR to agenda. It's always weird to edit myself. Benji, you are like person who match most of the PRs for agenda. Can you take a look if everything done correctly?
Yeah, have a quick look. Yeah, looks fine.
Hi all.
Hey, Hugh.
How's it going?
Going good.
Good. Happy Thursday.
Yeah, it's been a good one. It's been a good one.
Yeah.
How's it going with you?
It's going well. Yeah. Thursday's been great. I had
Nice.
several meetings with Ivan today, so that always makes it a great day.
Oh, wonderful.
It's just awesome. Looks like we have a fun-filled agenda today.
Yeah, indeed.
Hey, folks.
I'm starting to wish that GitHub ordered the agendas in reverse chronological order.
Oh yeah.
The list's getting a bit longer every time.
It is. Yeah, I agree.
I thought about adding like a directory layer in there for a year, but I don't want to like break all our old links.
Oh yeah.
I don't think it's necessary. It's like, what, 12 a year? It's going to be a while before it gets too far to scroll through, I think.
At what point does it start to paginate and we have to like click page 2? I don't know. What's the maximum number of files in a folder before the GitHub UI starts to break down?
Let's hope that Moore's law helps us there, yeah?
Yeah, I think so.
Fantastic. Speaking of which, I have to go pull up the agenda file.
And the notes, please.
And the notes. I always forget to do this before the meeting starts. I need to figure out how to like macro for that.
It's got the handy Google Docs to Markdown converter. What would be really nice is if it then had the reverse. That would make it a lot easier to populate it. Yep.
Agreed.
The GitHub column in the agenda seems to have worked well. Everyone's just automatically filled it out, so good fix.
Beautiful. All right, I have a doc, and now it's just a matter of putting the link in. All right, we have live notes. And we are looking good on attendees too. Let's see if I count. We got 15 names on our list and 13 people on the call, which is pretty dang close to a quorum. So I think we'll probably just get started and let anybody who's not here yet show up when they're going to show up. Although I don't know how close of an overlapping Venn diagram that is. So if your name's not on the agenda, send in a pull request. I'll get them merged in quickly. But as we always do, or actually first, a quick note. We all agree to the membership agreement, participation guidelines, and code of conduct. There's links in the agenda for those if you ever want to refresh yourself on what's there. Always good to get that out there first. And then with that, let's do a quick round of introductions. We will go down the list as it's written down in the agenda file. And if you don't have your name there yet, that's okay. You just introduce yourself at the end. So, hey, everybody, my name is Lee.
Oh, I guess I'm next. Hey, I'm Alex. I'm from Yelp in San Francisco.
I don't see Michael here yet.
I think someone should call out the names because the order you see is not the order we see as well.
In the agenda file, the agenda doc should look the same for everybody.
Okay, never mind. I was thinking the Zoom list. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good point. That's why I never want to go with the Zoom list because that one, yep, random math.random order. Michael's not here yet, so Benji, you're up.
Hey everyone, I'm Benji, maintainer at the GraphQL open source suite from the UK.
Hello, my name is Du Genkwei, and I come from Beijing, the capital of China.
We'll go to Morris next if you're here.
Hey, it just came in. I didn't realize it was right just in time. I work on a GraphQL proxy at IBM, and it's just in a few of these topics.
Cool. I'm Jordan from Facebook on the Relay team.
Hey, I'm Lauren, and I'm interested in the one-off talk.
My name is Noj. I'm at a startup recurrency before I was at Stripe, where I got the love of GraphQL, and I'm trying to convince my team to move to GraphQL from REST.
Hey, my name is Tim. I'm the founder of GraphCDN, and it's the first time to join. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. I'm Hugh in Ottawa, work for Apollo on several different open source projects like Apollo Client and Apollo Server.
Hi, my name is Ivan. I'm also from Apollo. Currently, I'm in Lviv, and I added few agenda items in the last minute in the end of the file.
I'll get them merged. We already heard
Everyone.
from you. So you're up, Rob.
Yeah. Hey everyone, I'm Robert. I'm from AWS.
Hi everyone, I'm Matt. I'm from Facebook on the native or mobile GraphQL team.
Hey everyone, I'm Sasha. I do GraphQL at Twitter.
Hey, I'm Steven. I do GraphQL infra stuff at Netflix.
We got everybody. Awesome. Very happy to have you all here. Thanks so much for doing introductions. Let's make sure we have enough people in our notes file. I see Benji has already made significant progress. And I see a handful of people have that open. Do we have enough folks who can jump in and take notes, especially as Benji jumps into conversation?
Where can I find the notes file? Ah, okay, I got it.
In the agenda doc, near the top, there's something that says live notes, and there's a link to a Google Doc.
Thanks, Stephen. I saw your hand up. Do add your name to the list.
most excellent. And sorry again for getting that up at the last possible minute, but you all are impressively copying over context there. Let's take a quick look at our agenda. We have a lot of stuff to talk about today, so we'll do our best to stay on time. I see a lot of these say 5 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and guess that that's optimistic, but I think even if we allot 10 to 15 for all of these, we should be able to get through them all. First, we're going to take a look at the action items. We're going to talk about the nullability RFC, argument name uniqueness, one of, map types, allowing descriptions on executable definitions, and why errors. That's a good list of things. Are we missing anything? And does this order seem reasonable? I see nodding heads. Sounds good. Let's jump into action items. I think in the last couple of meetings, we dove deep into these, so hopefully there are not too many that we need to dig into. I see nothing flagged as ready for review, which means that we're probably not going to spend too much time here, but let's take a quick look at what is open. We only have 5 past action items open. This makes me very happy. We used to have like 20 plus. So we've done very good on digging through our past actions. Do any of are any of these out of date, or
and a little warning? A little warning that I haven't been filing them recently, so that might be why we're looking so good. Sorry.
Fair enough. Fair enough. It's okay. Some of these actually seem somewhat relevant to some of our topics, so maybe we'll be able to come back to these in the next session. But all right, well, since we don't have any marked as ready for review and last meetings aren't in here, we'll skip past this. And did I just close my agenda file? I did. Whoops. Okay, so next up is nullability. Alex, I'll hand it to you.
Yeah, hello. Is it cool if I share my screen?
Please do.
All right. Yeah, so I just wanted to update everyone on the state of this. Had to take a little break, had to do my day job. But I'm working on this full time right now, hopefully through to the end. We are doing the including the question mark syntax that was described by Lee and I think a couple other people. So I need to update the straw man with that. We have a implementation up in GraphQL.js that is open for public review. We're looking for feedback on our test cases and the implementation in general. I've created this doc with sort of like a more readable list of test cases in case people like to look at that instead of code. That might be a little bit easier to read through.
Can you add a link to that to the agenda? That doc?
Oh yeah, for sure. I'll add it later. It's also linked in the PR, but I will add that. Yeah, test cases. We're going to begin rewriting the proposal next week based on the current state of the implementation, and then we'll sort of, as we get feedback on the implementation, we'll continue updating the proposal. And then we're going to open up a PR to GraphQL-spec by the end of next week. We also had meetings with Apollo and the Relay teams to get their feedback on the proposal. Let them speak for themselves on the details, but I think we're all in agreement about like the core of the behavior of the features that we're introducing. And we're also down to meet with maintainers of other client libraries if they'd like to discuss the proposal. Shoot me a message here. So a couple of questions. In the sort of like pathway to getting a proposal accepted, it mentioned that we might want to try to make our branch work with a client library. Would you suggest doing that? Yeah,
that seems reasonable.
Apollo let us know that they're deprecating their command line, their CLI tool, but they suggested that we try to integrate it with the Guild CLI tool. So we might try to do that.
I know that also Relay has experimented quite a lot with client-side enforcement of nullability, and so the syntax might be interesting to them. So that might be another fertile ground to do client-side experimentation.
Also, I can talk to the Urkel authors about it. A bunch of the Urkel authors are now working at GraphCDN, so we could make something happen there.
Cool. And then the action item that we have right now, do you want me to keep that up to date? Is that helpful? This guy.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, cool. I will make sure I do that. That was everything I had. Any questions?
What are the open, like what part of the implementation are you still exploring? I remember in the last conversation we had around this, the thing that we flagged but didn't really dig into too much was doing query validation. Like if you do field merging and you come across two fields, one of which uses an exclamation point or a question mark and the other one doesn't, is that allowed or not allowed? And what are the consequences of a decision like that? Have you explored that yet?
Yeah, they're effectively treated like they're just different types right now. So the field merging rules apply as if they were different types. If you have like a required string and a non-required string, so that would not be allowed. You can work around that by aliasing the fields, although it's kind of nonsensical with the bubbling up effect, because if one of them is null, then it just blows out the whole thing. Yeah. I think, is Jordan here? Relay, Relay talked about stripping out the exclamation points and then doing their own thing, which kind of helps them.
Yeah, I think our plan is, since we sort of present a facade of fragments being isolated, that we will strip them out and handle them, basically implement the semantic at runtime, but with the behavior that they're isolated to fragments, and that somewhere down the road, a response format that supports isolated names fragments would be the sort of right solution to get us back, to get that sort of as part of the spec. But I think we're comfortable with that divergence.
We have another doc that I can publish with sort of like a list of known problems with the current RFC. Other things on there are a list. There's currently no good way to indicate that a list item is non-nullable or like required. Relay and Netflix, the people that we're basing this off of, they both have, am I blanking on the word? It says at required or whatever. They both said that this isn't a problem that they've run into, but I think it's worth thinking about an upgrade path if that does become a problem, something that we can implement in the future, even if we don't do it as part of this proposal.
That would be super useful to have that doc, or if you want to, one of the things we did recently is pull a bunch of the spec working doc markdown files into this working group repo. That way we can just give people more liberal access to commit rights or merge rights. That might be a good place for this, especially if you find that there's a kind of a long tail of issues you want to work through and want to keep that up to date, so people who are going to watch along with this can keep track of it and offer feedback.
Sure. Yeah, I could do that.
Or whatever process works for you, just offering that as an option.
Yeah.
What are you looking for now? Do you need feedback? Do you need code review? What will unblock you?
Yeah, we're looking for feedback on the implementation. So in the GraphQL.js thing. And then I think we're good otherwise on what the path forward is. Yeah. Was there anything else we need to do, or besides opening up another PR to GraphQL.spec or -spec with the proposal itself?
Yeah, the proposal itself, the changes to the spec, I think will be helpful. Actually, I think that's probably a good, in addition to iterating on this pull request and getting it to a point where you are happy with it. I found it pretty useful to do spec text writing and code rewriting in parallel, because you'll find forcing you to think about it in terms of the spec will highlight gaps in your implementation, and the writing the implementation will highlight gaps in the crispness of the spec text. And so doing that at the same time can be helpful to make sure you feel confident in the total direction. So that might be a good thing to dig into. But certainly it seems like you've already gotten a little bit of feedback on the pull request from Sahaj, but yeah, that's a great call to action for anybody interested in this to go take a look.
For sure. Okay. Yep, that's all I had.
Very exciting. Thanks for your continued work on this. This is one of the proposals I'm most excited about. I know it's going to be tough to get it right, but great progress.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, that was actually pretty dang close to 5 minutes, a little bit over. So looks good for keeping us on time. Next up is argument name uniqueness. And I think Du or Yvonne, do either of you want to take this?
We discussed it before a call in GitHub issue, and you asked me to champion it to help present it. So, to solve initial confusion, there is 3 PRs with this proposal in the repo. One initial PR did have CLI, and we have some problem with continuous integration, so you recreated. Another one, also we had action item for me to help to move this proposal further, and I forget proposal exists, so I independently did the same changes second time. Fun fact, it's exactly the same, so word by word, even though I did it independently. It's basically validated, super simple feature, and I would say non-controversial. If 2 people wrote the same spec text, I think it's self-descriptive. I created a GraphQL JS PR. Probably it's outdated. I don't know if it's matchable or not, because right now we're preparing a new release of GraphQL JS, so a lot of changes, but everything is there, test cases. Plus, by the way, what the spec proposal about, if you wasn't, previous time, by the way, big thanks to Benji for presenting. I was first time I missed working group call, so Benji stepped in and presented instead of me. So proposal is about adding validation to type system to forbid duplicating arguments. It's super simple. It's more like a mission, but since it's a new validation rule, technically you cannot specify duplicating argument on queries. It's forbidden, but you can specify duplicating argument definition. So I don't expect we will actually break anybody. Worst case scenario, we break some really weird introspections. So if somebody return introspection with couple duplicating argument definitions, it will be break. Happy to answer any questions if anyone have. And the idea is to move it into stage 2 and match GraphQL JS PR.
So let me make sure I just understand one piece of this. This is about unique argument definitions, and we already have one for unique arguments. So is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm with you on this feeling non-controversial. Anyone have any trepidations here or anything they'd like to see?
I realize I reviewed the GraphQL JS PR back in June. This is completely non-controversial, in my opinion.
Yep, I'm gonna say ship it. I think this is at least stage 2. I'm gonna call this, yeah, let's just make this stage 2. I'll move it in the GitHub. I just changed the label right now. We will probably move it from 2 to 3 in the next meeting, or we could even do it asynchronously between now and then. But certainly you should get this merged into GraphQL JS and shipped out there. And that'll give us a little bit of time to just triple check that this doesn't cause any issue and get the right test coverage that you want to see. But yeah, thanks for the careful read, both of you, Yvonne and Du. Great work. Okay, that was actually exactly 5 minutes. So incredible. We're so on time today. Moving on, one of, oh boy, Benji, handing this to you.
Hey everyone, and if someone else can take over taking the notes, that would be appreciated. So I have not done much work on one of for a little while. Primarily, that's been because I've had the lack of time, but partly I'm not 100% certain that it's definitely the right solution, especially factoring in the limitations that I think we're going to apply to the initial version of it, which is namely that it's going to be input objects only, I think, to start with. So there's a few things I wanted to discuss, or at least to raise. The first and most simple of them is I've been rethinking the syntax a little bit. I've always said it doesn't really matter, like the one-off feature will work the same independent of what the syntax is in SDL, but the syntax is something that people get hung up on. And also, if we were to apply it to field arguments, which we haven't necessarily agreed to do at this stage, but we might want to, doing it with a directive is really awkward because the directive location is not really in a semantically sensible place for the meaning of it. So what I'm proposing we do at the moment with this RFC is that we use a one-of keyword that would come either before the curly braces that define the fields for an input type or an output type, or before the parenthesis that define the argument for a field. So then it makes it much more obvious that it's one of this list of things that is defined in that parenthesis or curly braces. So that is my syntactic proposal. You can read it in, I think, the very last comment in that particular issue, pull request, I think. That's quite a simple one. Let's pause there for a moment. Does anyone have any feedback on that proposal? I should probably summarize what the one of is about. Is everyone familiar? Yeah, general nodding.
Can you hear me actually?
Yes, yeah. Go for it.
Okay, sorry. So we at the guild, we implemented actually one of with the directives for input objects and also for input arguments. And I totally agree with you that on input arguments, it's like super awkward and it doesn't make sense from just looking at it. So I guess the syntax you proposed in the issue definitely makes more sense.
I'm less sure, mainly because where we started with this didn't really include arguments. We started with input objects and wanting specifically in input, like the whole conversation that led us here was input unions. And so arguments is a little bit orthogonal and really like a nicety. Like we noticed that there's similarities between input objects and arguments. And we said, hey, if we have a solution for one, we should see if it matches for the other. And this feels like we're making the solution for inputs a little bit more complicated, because now there's a syntax change just to make the arguments case read easier when that was not our original goal. And I have an alternate proposal, which actually brings you back to your original proposal, Benji. And it's not necessarily ideal. It's a trade-off. So I'm curious what people think, but it's one that has some precedent. So if we use a directive, and so directive on an input object, the @one of, or whatever we want to finally name that. If you have a set of arguments that you want to restrict to only one particular argument of a set, you use an input object. And so the precedent I'm thinking of is for mutations. It's really common to have like a bag of arguments for a mutation be an input object, and to have the mutation field accept that input object as one argument. You know, we can question about whether that's a reasonable pattern. It has some historical consequences, but like certainly we see that pattern show up quite a lot. And it might make it a little bit more obvious that you have something there that is different, right? Like you got to supply one of a particular set of things. It certainly makes the one argument case a little bit more awkward because you have to wrap it in an input object, but it would allow us to scope this down to only input objects. Thoughts on that?
Oh, go on. You go first.
Yeah, so I personally, I can also say that like using just an input object feels more natural, especially since right now the syntax doesn't like the custom implementation based on directive doesn't like, yeah, you must place the directive at the end. So most of the time we build some complex filter, and yeah, we also use just like on off on an input object instead of like the field arguments, and it feels better to use it like that. And as you said, maybe we don't need to support both yet.
I also was a proponent on keeping symmetry, because other than that proposed change, input fields are pretty symmetrical with arguments. You can have default values, you can have like everything else you can do on input fields, you can do on arguments. But thinking more about this, I think it's actually anti-pattern. If you do one of arguments on a field, it basically means you can never add like another argument at all. So if you ever decide you want some additional stuff, additional like option or additional configuration, you like simply cannot add it, and you're stuck in this situation, and you basically need to deprecate entire field and do like name switching stuff. So I'm actually rethinking my, like theoretically it's cool to continue to have a symmetry, but practically speaking, it's very like for schema design purposes, it's very dangerous to have like situation when you cannot add any new arguments to a field.
Yeah, this actually, I recently have been dealing with command line arguments, and one really clever thing one of the libraries I'm using does is allow argument groups. So you say, okay, this argument is a group, there's a group of arguments that we accept exactly one of those must be part of it. And so long as you have one of those arguments set, it's valid. But if you have none, it's not. And if you have two, it's not. And so but the advantage to that, if you label like one of group, like at directive, one of group, name the group, you can then add additional values in the input object later that don't fit into the one of, but must be passed in or optionally can be passed in. And like making it impossible to have that setup feels a little bit like we're reducing the power.
We have groups just with wrapping. So like you can use input types as arguments. It just like it's possible. It's wrapping, and entire one-off proposal is about wrapping. So we agree that having like simpler version and more like type-safe version, it justify additional layer of wrapping. So if we decided for input fields, maybe it's better to also have this for arguments. You can always have input types grouping.
What do you think is, as we provide more options, ways to do things, there's more ways for schema designers to kind of shoot themselves in the foot or backed into a corner. And so, in this case, maybe keeping it simpler is encouraging people to fall into the pit of success in their schema. Since it's it's not obvious at first, like this this problem we're describing where you can't add arguments. So just make it impossible to get yourself in that situation.
I love that point. It's always an argument to make your type system less useful and dumb because there's fewer ways to misuse it if it's less useful. Sounds counterintuitive, but I've definitely seen it play out that way.
All good points. I think my main motivation with this is I think we might revisit this later and change our minds and want to extend one of two arguments. We might not, but we might. And so I wanted to try and sort of preserve that option value there, because doing that with a directive, as we've already seen in actual implementations from the guild, for example, is not comfortable. It is awkward. And the directive approach also kind of, as I think you pointed out a while ago, Lee, it feels like a different type. That's why we actually went through and created the tagged type at one point. Really, it's a variant of a type, but again, it does feel like it should be elevated to a concrete stature. So I think we're, for the sake of adding a keyword to the language rather than using a directive, and it would be quite a simple, straightforward change to the syntax, I think. Would it not? You're more familiar with the writing the parsers and stuff than me, Lee. Do you feel it would be straightforward?
It's less about how complicated the syntax change is, and it's more about just like a black and white, does it or does it not change the syntax? At least here we're talking about changing the syntax for the schema language, which the cascading effect of breaking things is much lower there than if we were going to change the syntax or the query language. But even still, like this kind of the, if we're adding in a new syntax change, then I think your criteria that you just described is the right one. Like it is a meaningfully new thing. But this specific proposal that you put in here still doesn't quite feel like a new thing. Like it's still input the name of the thing. Like literally all it is the exact same syntax as the directive, but with the @ sign removed. And for a casual reader, I don't know that they would appreciate the nuance of what's happening there and might either misread it as a directive and accidentally add an @ sign, which would parse correctly, but then not do the thing that they thought it would do. Or maybe they would drop an @ sign from the directive that comes after that and then get a parse error and be confused why. So like because of its location and behavior and similarity, I worry that it ends up being a little bit too nuanced for someone who hasn't spent the last like 24 months thinking about input unions. And that's why my bias is to push it towards existing syntax space or make it significantly different, which is I think what our goal was with the tag type was it's not a object type, it's not an input type, like it's a distinctly different thing. And
yeah,
I don't remember exactly the reason why we decided to pull it back to the directive, but I think it's reasonable that we did.
Okay, cool. Yeah, seems reasonable. I think the only other slight bit of pushback that I have was against your very first bit of feedback, which is where you said this all came out of solving the input unions problem. And when I was thinking about this, it wasn't only to solve that problem. It was also to solve things like you often have getters in GraphQL, like get a user by their email or get a user by, some ID or some other thing. And those are convenient. At the moment, like in schemas that I write, I give them dedicated fields because it's the only way to do it in a type safe way. We can do it, as you say, if we have one-off for input objects, we can have it like get user by and then an input object. That is possible. But in those kind of fields, you don't tend to add additional arguments. Maybe you might, but I don't tend to see them. It's like just get a user by their email. That's it. There is no other complexity to it. But there we go. They could be. Maybe it factors in whether they're archived or not or something in future. Who knows? But yes, so kind of what I want to say here is the one-of can be a solution to the input unions problem, but it wasn't designed with only that intent in mind. It was just bundled in with it because that was what we were solving at the time. So my intent for it was a little bit broader, which brings me nicely onto the second part of this conversation. So one of my main hesitations for one-of is it feels wrong to have a polymorphism on the input that is so distinct from polymorphism on the output. And also, if we were to add one-of as I'm currently proposing it, even with just for input types, you get much more powerful form of polymorphism that allows not just one of multiple object types, but it also allows scalars, it also allows lists. It can allow the same type to be used multiple times with different labels. And it feels wrong to have more powerful polymorphism on input than we have on output. Not necessarily wrong, it just, it feels hard to explain. And I've thought a lot about the polymorphism that we have in the output of GraphQL as well. And we often get people talking about using more flexible data sources like MongoDB, for example, and wanting to express that more flexible data types. Now, I would say GraphQL's purpose is to abstract those kind of things, right? It's not meant to be like a linear mapping of those things. So we want to define a really nice, neat schema that exposes that in a consistent way. However, we do still have situations where these things exist. And especially in the case of what we're seeing more of people combining lots of GraphQL schemas together into one larger schema, federation and stitching and all the other type things. We're seeing more and more people needing to convert these data stores before then aggregating them. I was at the GraphQL conf the other day, and Min Chen from LinkedIn was talking about what they've been doing at LinkedIn. They've got a framework that they use called rest.li, and that's how they had their REST API defined, and they now want a GraphQL layer over it. And they've been converting things from their service entity definitions over to GraphQL, and they've been doing that automatically. And it turns out they have a type that is almost exactly what I'm proposing would be the output type. They have that already in their REST APIs and they need to convert it. Min shared with me one of their union types that they call it a union type. One of the union types that they have currently, which is for images. So when you specify that this has an image, that image could be either a profile picture for a user, in which case it's just profile picture for Benji, done. Or it could be school logo for name of school, or it could be company name logo for name of company, or it could be an image. And then if it's an image, then it becomes a whole image object and it gets a whole load of properties like its URL, its original URL, what its width is, what its height is, and a whole bunch of other stuff that you don't get with the other types. So they are actually converting that at the moment to GraphQL object types. And they just know that every single field on those are nullable and one of them will be set, which is exactly what the one-off proposal is. So I've been waiting for a while to see someone using this kind of thing in the wild, and no one's reported it back to me, but I did happen to notice it in a conference talk. So, you know, there are people doing it. Basically, I'm not keen to add one-off unless we also have it on output. It feels wrong to me. It is good to have a solution to the input polymorphism problem. But if we're not going to add it to output, then it might not be the right solution. One of the things that I really felt that the one-off proposal has is that symmetry that it offers and the simplicity that it's built on all the existing types with just very simple validation rules added. And I feel like if we remove that symmetry, then we should probably reevaluate what the other potential solutions to the input union problem is and see if any of them are actually better, given that it no longer has this advantage.
I'm with you. I mean, I feel like this was the main motivation in why we spent so long exploring the tag type proposal, was that it offered sort of maximal parity between input and output, to the point where I think it offered too much and it created confusion in the overlap case. I think I agree that we want, I don't know if I agree to the extreme that if we can't figure out how to do this for the output type system, that we shouldn't do it for input type system. I think we're still going to deliver a bunch of value by getting this right for input. But I'm with you that having some symmetry between the two would be desirable. And if we can figure that out, then that's a great thing. I think last time we talked about this, we decided to explicitly scope it down just in the hope of making continued progress and getting to something that we feel really good about and can approve. But I'm 100% with you on the broader vision of having parity for input and output. And I think it's a better way to represent unions. I think like if we had this, we should encourage it over typical unions for most new schema.
Okay, that's good to hear. So I think steps forward might be to change the current RFC to factor out the arguments, keeping in mind that we may add them in future, to potentially, I can't remember whether it's currently got output factored in or not, but anyway, to add output, even if we then scope it back out so that we can then scope it back in as a follow-up one. But I think if anyone feels that one of the other input union solutions, if we weren't to extend one of to output, then it loses that advantage. Does that then mean that any of the other input union solutions is now better? So if anyone feels that they have an input union solution that is better purely for the input case, I would certainly be interested to hear it and discuss it. Because at the end of the day, I want what's best for GraphQL. Ivan.
Yeah, I think I have the same position as Lee. So if it's work for input, it's good by itself. One thing I'm worried is what happened. Like for input, it's okay. You provide one of the things and you send it over the network. But for output inside the query, you list like all the possibilities you care for. So you expect to get something, but later somebody extends schema with a new item, so you don't get anything. Is it like surprising or not? Surprising behavior? Because previously, like until this particular update, you was always getting something. And especially, I'm not sure about semantics, but I think natural mapping in code generation would be enums in modern languages, like in languages where enums is not like just strings, but the fields, like I think Rust have it and Kotlin, if I'm correct. So like I think to check if it can be enum, because we have like two different meaning. We have like now, we have like null and empty, which is like different. Like I don't want to prolong discussion. My point is that I will write up a comment in your proposal and we can discuss it asynchronously offline. But for me, input case it's like way simpler than output case is. So just wanted to propose that we advance it like anyway, even if we're stuck.
Yeah, I'm remembering Avantish to respond to your point. I think that's also a problem with our existing unions, where if you add a new case to a union, you can end up with something where like at most you get the type name and then you get nothing else, which I don't know, maybe that's marginally better because at least you know what it was called in the thing you didn't get. But that's certainly a case that we already kind of have. So there's some parity there. I think like the reason why output one-ofs were complicated in the past is the actual execution and response form behavior is meaningfully different. And when addressing this kind of type, it doesn't respond the same way that a object type does. Whereas inputs, you could have an old client that doesn't know anything about one of, and as long as you sort of go by the letter of the rule, everything will just keep working. So I think there's going to be some complications with getting output type right. But I'm at least a little bit less worried about the case of like exhaustive enum checking, because we already have to have code generators handle that case for the whether you want to call it empty or unknown or something like that. Lauren, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, I actually also wanted to mention that we already have this issue with unions, and even today there is kind of a way to actually work around that, and that is if you make this server aware of what is actually requested in the selection set and analyzing that, and then send null or whatever back instead of like just the type name or whatever. But yeah, it's complicated. And then even on top of that, if we would have like one of object types, do we even still need union types? Then what's the use case for a union type, and when should you use an object one of union? It might also confuse people, right?
Yeah, I think as Lee hinted before, it would probably be, if we added this to output types, we'd probably in general recommend it over unions. I've thought about them quite a lot, and I see basically three features that unions have that the tagged type do not. One of them is the type name when you haven't asked it about its specific type, which we've just discussed, is what Ivan just raised. So with the one-off type as it currently stands, you get no information. With a union, if you weren't expecting it, you get, you can get at least its type name, but that's it. Another thing is, of course, unions are flatter. They don't introduce that extra layer, that extra object layer. So there's that. And the third thing is that in a union, you can do a fragment spread over an interface type that at least one of the types in that union implements. I'm not sure how useful that is. And I think if you need that, you should probably be using an interface. But it is a thing that you can do with the union that you would not be able to do with a tag type. So those are basically the three restrictions. I was actually talking with Greg from Shopify, and they have need for one of in input. They don't really, they did think of an example where they wanted it in output, but have since replaced that with an interface-based approach. But what they were suggesting is that we could potentially add like a field name. Just like we've got dunder type name, we could add dunder field name to indicate which of the fields is present. I think potentially calling it field name would work actually, because aliases are aliases, so it's fine. That would then give us that extra bit of information. It might also be an optimization as well for the code generators, because then you can use, like in TypeScript, you could use a what's the word? Something union? Discriminated union. You could use a discriminated union for it. So you just look at that key you know definitely exists, see what value it is, and then you know that that other property exists. So there may be value in that. But again, if we push adding one of to output to a separate stage, we can potentially add that then, or we could even do that as a third change later if we felt that we really needed it. Anywho, I have hogged enough of the time, so I think we should probably move on. Thank you very much for your input, everyone.
Yeah, I'm very excited that you're coming back to this. It does seem like we are really narrowing in on something that feels very good for inputs. I'm with you on the symmetry. If we can get symmetry, that's going to be great. But yeah, I'm sure if between now and the next time we talk, you explore the problems that fall out of object type one of, which I know we explored a little bit in the past with the tag type proposal. And hopefully we can get a good sense of just how close we can get to the parity that we want. Okay, next up, map types. Nash.
Hey, how's it going? Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. I will share my screen. I'll give a Zoom. Sorry, let me get some real estate on my Zoom window. There's a lot going on here. Hide floating meeting controls. There we go. That's the map type. I will close this. All right. So the proposal has evolved a bit from the initial. The initial was allowing a map type which would use a similar syntax as lists, but use a curly brace to denote this as a map. After iterating, and I think Ivan has provided great feedback, I'm somewhat settled on the proposal, which is a list transformation. And what we mean by that is, suppose there's a type of called users, which returns a list of users. You can index on the ID and then would turn a list into a map and return that. So it follows in a similar vein to how GraphQL does aliases, where you can rename a field and then get something else, but this would be a transformation on lists. Ivan, feel free to add more if you want. I know you've been thinking a lot about this as well. And then because it's a list, you could have a list of lists. So there's a couple of things that I want to align on, and I'll just go down to that. I have written some questions, but before I go, I do want to ensure, should I go a bit deeper into the proposal, or does everyone have somewhat of context before we jump into some of the questions?
Can you give a little bit more context? I don't know if everybody has followed along quite as much as you and Yvonne have.
All right, cool. I will open GraphQL. VS Code. Suppose you have a type called user, right? And a user has ID of ID, has a name of a string, has some profile URL, and that is a string. In GraphQL, this would be returned as user. Now, GraphQL is nice because a relationship is either something that points to a specific object or points to a list of objects. But what if you want to get users keyed in by the ID? So you want to get the users something like ID1 and the name is foo. And something in there, and then the second thing would happen for the second one. So a great example, I think Ivan kind of like mentioned, was in GitHub. When you query the GraphQL repo, you would have to specify this is the spec, this is the JS, and for individual, you'd have to make queries. But if you do a map type, then you can take the list and transform it into a map or a dictionary keyed by name, and you would get that result out. And in a vein, this allows you to query lists, but get results back as a map. So in most implementations, say in client side, doing a map lookup is O1, while filing an element inside the list is an ON operation. So this saves you in that and makes the client side more efficient when using those GraphQL responses. I'm going to pause here for 5 seconds to let that digest. Okay. Ivan, do you want to add a few of your thoughts in here before we proceed?
Yeah, so like disclaimer, I'm the author, one of co-authors of GraphQL Dash. And like when people discuss it inside the poll, and I think discuss in general, they like remember experiment we did like years ago. And it was idea to push boundaries. But during that, we learned like people like it's have almost 1,000 stars. I didn't contribute. Like it's useful for people. People use it for something, but at the same time, Odash is too big. Like some key transformation. It's like I think it's Pareto law, so you can satisfy 80% of use cases with 20% of transformation, and I think it's top one. I never proposed it because I'm myself not a GraphQL user, so I don't have use cases, and I feel like somebody person who have actual use cases need to champion this proposal and see what fits and what not. I'm like against doing server-side map for like 2 reasons. And I think in original issue, Lee outlined one of them. It's like what should be in an index. If you have like a couple keys in a type, like couple fields can be indexes, and it's not a question of transport layer. It's not a question of schema definition to define. Like defining a key is opinionated. What should be the only key. And second thing is ordering. Previously, we have an issue of previously we required fields to be sent at the same order as required inside the query, and people, I believe people from Go community have like big issues with that because they like maps unordered, so that force like I think you did the change to say it's recommended, but it's not required after a long discussion. So basically, we cannot do any ordering on maps. We cannot guarantee. We can guarantee only if it's done like client side. We cannot and language support order maps. So that's why I'm like resurrected my old idea of transformation. And idea is to make it simple. We discussed a couple of variants. So variants, I think we settled down on is the simplest one of just transforming biggest issue, what if we have a list of lists? So we just transform it to a map. And second question, what to do with key clashes? What if you have like duplicating keys? An idea is to reuse ID argument. So like to restrict it to ID, and ID is unique enough to use as a key. And it's basically a string with the semantic.
Does GraphQL actually enforce, so in a list, if you have a field with an ID, will it enforce that each of the ID fields within the list, right? So in that case, if it's not enforced, then in semantics, ID exclamation is the same as string exclamation, right? It's just for the user to know like this is a non-human readable.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Maybe we need to come with some other mechanism to flag if fields you can use transformation on. But yeah, it's details of proposal. Let's discuss the general idea, motivation, use cases, and how useful it is, and we can figure out restriction on the keys later, since it's right now we're discussing stage 0 proposal with the idea of moving to stage 1.
Right. I think someone brought up a point, is if it is a transformation of list, is the feature strong enough such that GraphQL should do that, or should be done at user space? And I think that is a valid question. And my argument on that is, if GraphQL is supporting aliases, which this is in the similar kind of like realm, it makes it very easy to consume the GraphQL responses and have very fast lookups into those lists, which happens like when you have a list and you want to do, hey, let's do some action on a list. You like doing the lookups and changing list prediction is a very, very common pattern. So I do feel like it has legs, but before diving too deep, I do want to know whether the GraphQL folks, you think they should even progress further, or we should just cut it off at this.
I have relatively strong opinions here, but I put a comment with my fairly strong opinion. So if anybody else wants to dig in.
Okay. I guess this is you.
Yeah, that's me.
Okay, sounds good. I will take a look at it async. But for this proposal over here, Ivan, from like duplicate case, I know you mentioned something about data loss. So do you feel strongly against that duplicate keys should error out, or one overrides the others, which is a behavior in Python and JavaScript and other tools?
Yeah, I think it's like in proposal, that's why we have a stages. Stage 1 is to recognize it as a problem. So and stage like 2 is to figure out technical other like edge cases. I think it's edge case. I want to provide a couple of use cases from original issue. I think like this PR started from issue number 101, and a lot of people actually like it. Avoided, not like avoided. And idea was, what if there is like a couple of use cases there, and one strong use cases is like for some type of CMS systems and other systems allow users specify like client specific values, and they like dynamic, and recommended ways to specify them was to use key values. Like for a lot of stuff, recommended solutions that we always recommend is key value. For example, like, I don't know, you have HTTP headers and you want to expose a set of HTTP headers. You expose them we recommend you to expose them as key values pairs. So it's like standard pattern. The problem here, GraphQL at the moment optimized to solve use case when you show all the data, meaning like if you want to show all key value pairs to represent them, to render them in some way, it's enough and GraphQL is working for that. But what if you want to check if something is present or not? In that case, you either need to do transformation in a client, or you need to use like a find on array to check if like stuff exists there. So working with key value pairs is hard, and it's from reading these comments, I think like it's the most common use case here. Another common use case I showed in my GraphQL example, people actually expose one field to get one item of something, meaning you have like repositories to get all the repositories and repository to get one repository. And it's work nice if you have, if you want to query for one repository. What if you want to query for a couple? And I personally had the situation when I tried to generate changelog for GitHub, and I ended up actually generating query as a text with aliases, and it's bad because like you need to sanitize. Not everything can be valid alias, and like there is other problem with alias, like you cannot dynamically add stuff like that. So solution for that would be to introduce a repositories field as I showed below. But what you will get as a response, and the reason I think people not doing it right now, is you get like array. And for client, it's not only about, for me, it's not about algorithmic efficiency, how efficient it is to search an array or a map. It's more about developer experience. I would say like people, if you have like big amount of data, you will use pagination anyway, but and for small amount of data like ON or O1 is less important. But developer experience, the fact that you need to do like find or something or create map yourself is hard. So GraphQL always say you can get data that you want. It's a question, should we allow you to get in the shape that you want?
Right. Yeah. I very much like the Strawman Zero is this a problem? Do we recognize a problem and should we be solving it? I think you make a great point, Ivan. I've personally experienced this as well. I know you've made a comment. Do you want to give a few kind of like 10-second answer on your comment? Like, I know you had strong opinions.
Yeah, I can. So yeah, Matt here. So I have some very strong opinions about introducing map as a type, given there's no way to differentiate it in the response from an object for like, because it's essentially when we're getting it as a response, it looks no different from an object type, which we already have. So like the nice thing with lists is, hey, we know this is explicitly like something a little bit different because it's got the list syntax. So when we're parsing, it's easier, whatever. So the other thing is that not all languages support maps in the way that like using JSON, like not all languages have, and I'm specifically thinking of like C++, how you would use maps with C++. The way that you would use a JSON map, it's not like you have the lookup semantics that are necessarily exactly the same. In fact, a map, a like standard map in C++ is often backed by a list of pairs, right? And given that, I do think that there is a real need for user-supplied generic types, right? We have no concept of a pair of arbitrary types. And I think that this is actually a real problem with GraphQL in that you can't describe, okay, I want to have a pair that my client system is going to be able to operate over generically. So when I get a list of this pair, I can treat it as a map, regardless of how it's coming over the wire. And that's another kind of key thing here, is that GraphQL is not defined as a JSON spec. So you can use GraphQL without using JSON. JSON is not a prerequisite for GraphQL. So making sure that, like, if you have a more optimized format for sending GraphQL from server to client, making sure that will work with this new map type adds a lot of complexity. Whereas for user, if we had a more like user created generic types, it might be easier to do what you want without requiring every implementation to do the same thing.
Right. So if I understand correctly, it's the idea is introducing generic types, but the response value would still be an array with field names, like it would be an object with key and a value. And it's up to the consumer to decide how to interpret the underscore type name and turn that into a different representation.
Essentially. Although not using underscore type name, I like when
another way. I'm just going to toss an idea out there too, Matt, because I think what Matt's proposing here is really intriguing. It puts it all in user space, and as soon as we add generics, things are going to get really complicated in our type system. So my heart rate rises when I hear generics, because I don't want to have to figure out all the details of it. But there is something interesting that I think largely would probably be unpopular and therefore not work, but maybe is worth talking about here, which is if we really want to support the generic concept of a map, a key value pair, probably the right way to represent that in the response is actually a list of tuples or a list of key value pairs, or whichever of these sort of alternate proposals Matt has sort of spelled out here, because that would allow you to skip past this whole suite of problems that you and Yvonne have explored of, do you limit this to string keys or ID keys? Can they be nullable or non-nullable? Like, you can skip past all of that if you define a map purely as a list of pairs. It would also allow us to sidestep the ordered non-ordered problem, because in the output form, they are still lists and still therefore ordered. But the why I think this is probably unpopular is I expect the reason why most people want this is they just want the raw JSON output to give them a JSON object. And less so say, you know, hey, I have a map on my back end. I want a map on my front end, and I want to transport between the two and query it effectively. And which is why I think like a lot of what I was poking at in the original issue that got closed was, what is actually the problem that we're solving here? Because that issue tossed out many very different problems that sort of glossed over as like a map type could solve all of these. And I think that's probably not true. Like, a solution would work well for one and work really poorly for the other, right? A map type that restricts you to non-nullable string keys broadly describes very few in practice maps where the key type can be a lot more variable. A lot of folks just want a blob JSON type, right? Like, I think that was an early comment on your new issue open, which was like, hey, I don't know the type of the values. It's arbitrary. And it's like, oh, right. Yeah, you don't want a map type. You want arbitrary JSON type. So I think getting a better understanding of exactly what the problem domain is that is so popular that people want to solve is really what's necessary here. Because then I think it'll really help us guide where we want to go to solve that problem. And whether it is unlocking something new in GraphQL or whether it is a simplification or some expressivity over what we can already do. I think like the proposal that you and Yvonne have prototyped here is certainly really interesting and compelling, but I'm worried that it might not pass our guiding principles. It's not necessarily a new capability. It's really like an existing type system that you're now doing some post-processing on. And I think it maybe goes against the idea of simplicity over expressiveness. Like this is offering expressiveness. And like that principle is there, not to say expressiveness is bad. It's just like we have to take a stance of how we make decisions between simplicity and expressiveness. And we've decided in the past to go for simplicity. This syntax is definitely a lot more complicated and it's a lot more expressive. And that's really interesting, but like it kind of goes against that guiding principle that we've set for ourselves.
Right. I do know we're on the 20 minutes time, but I do want to add, like the maps, it varies a lot of different problem sets. And one thing I've seen for a while is to say like, well, there's so many problems, therefore we're not going to solve them. But I think they're very specific. If you break down the problem, there is like the ID, string ID with a type, right? There is this type could be anything in the key. But if you just look at JSON, where the keys are always strings and the value could be a bunch of things, and GraphQL, the #1 response format is a string, I do think that is a problem. Like you run into that all the time, especially when you query databases which represent fields as maps, which you then have to turn into key value and then go on the other way and then turn it back into another. So that transformation is definitely a problem that I have experienced, and I've mentioned others who have experience as well. But that being said, I do know we're on time, just wanted to mention that.
One other kind of point that you could look at is the connection specification, which is not like in the spec per se, but like relays connection, how relay deals with things, types whose name ends in connection, is essentially creating a map type that allows you to paginate through it as a map. It's definitely more complex than like a JSON map in the response, but it is a handshake that like the server and the client agree. Each element in here, I can ask for from the server. I can ask for the next N in this map. Like I can get any one of these by passing down the cursor for a specific item in the map. And it might be interesting if we could kind of batten down what a map, if we couldn't change the language, what would a map generic type in the sense of a connection generic type kind of look like? And is there a way that we could change the language to simplify that or make that more clear and like make it easier for everyone to use?
Fair.
Yeah, another way to maybe kind of back up from this is we got to take ourselves out of the JavaScript world. Like JSON I think is an easy thing to pin ourselves on, but even in JavaScript, it's really common to think about a map as string keyed, just because up until ES6 map types, like that's just the way that JavaScript developers operate, but it's not necessarily the way that all other languages do that. So and just to say, like as people who are more familiar with other languages approach GraphQL, they'll bring their own internal conception of what a map is and then be like surprised or not based on what they find of how it works, which I think is like, just to kind of reinforce the point, goes back to the better we can crisply define the problem or problems we want to solve. And like to your point, Naj, of if there are multiple problems, our answer shouldn't be, hey, there's too many problems, so we should do nothing. It's, hey, here's the set of problems we have. Here's the relative importance of each of those. And then here's the suite of solution space we're going to dive into for each, which might be some combination of post-processing, new types, patterns, the JSON type scalar, or even like recommending like patterns for people. Like we might find that the answer here is actually doesn't require any spec change. It's just a matter of defining a community standard and building tools around that. So I think we have a lot of space to explore to figure this out. But the sooner we can kind of pare it down to the set of problems that at least you as a champion are most interested in solving, and then make sure that you have the sort of the community's nod that that's the right thing to go into, then I think that'll give you a lot of fervor and that you'll find the right path.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me.
Well, thank you both for you, Naj, to resurrecting this work, and also Yvonne for the heavy feedback and iteration. I think this is probably the most valuable conversation we've had about map types since it was first posed many years ago. So serious progress. We will move on to descriptions on executable definitions. Yvonne, this one is yours.
I will also try to share my screen. Can you allow me to share screen?
You're still sharing a screen currently.
Okay.
I am trying to figure out how to stop sharing my screen. Therefore, I found it.
Yeah. But because I think it's easier to see this example. Yeah. Let's try. So you see my screen, right? And I created PR. I created PR for a description on executable definition. First, we already discussed it on previous working group. It was back in March. But back then it wasn't any particular proposal. We just have like, I think we had like an hour of free time, very short agenda. So we decided to discuss like if anyone had proposal, and it was my proposal. Initially, I had it for very weird use case, but since then I learned it's not that uncommon. It's actually like pretty popular use case when you generate something from your queries. Like most popular one is code generation, and you either generate function or a type or something else. So in large code bases, especially if GraphQL files live separately from your code base, it makes sense to attach some description to queries and fragments. Basically, right now you can attach description only to, like, to qualify, we have both in GraphQL description and comments. First version of SDL use comments as description. That's why there is still a lot of confusion in ecosystem. But since then, we settled up on using like special description with quotation mark before types. And this proposal is to basically allow the same for queries, fragments, and query variables. So in my case, I wanted to generate Slack command from a query file and use operation description as command description and argument as command argument description. You can do the same with like CLI commands or code generation or like a form or bunch of stuff. And key difference from a command description actually attached to something, and it's explicit. So if you write, instead of like description, I write comment here, it can be like fix me, to do. So like it can be accidental description. Like today I presented to my team in Apollo and actually learned that I think Apollo iOS team, Apollo Android, I think, yeah, Apollo Android team using, I think they're using comments on operation as description and putting them in generated code, which is not ideal since we want to separate comments from description. So basically change is simple. I need to figure out how to document it properly in PR. For some reason it's stuck to us. I cannot switch like panels. Yeah, working now. So I changed like grammar to allow it, and I did like stop section to language paragraph, and we have same section in type system paragraph. So we still need to figure out how to match two in one, but this is basically idea here is to like recognize is if it's something we want to do or not, and have like and I will start working on PR to GraphQL.js. Two key points like operation fragment and query variables, and you cannot add a description to short form of operation. If you use curly braces, you cannot add description. It's like problematic. It's make everything easier, and plus it's weird if you add description to something without a name. So technically you can add it without a name. You can add description and query and curly braces. It's valid, but it's like it's your own decision. So like for short form, I think description don't make sense at all. So any questions or comments?
Would we want to end up, or I know not from this PR, but would we end up wanting to expand string descriptions for things like variable definitions?
Yeah, it's here. Oh, so I make a mistake. I used.
Oh, okay.
Actually,
okay. Yeah. That. Okay. Yeah. That I was like,
yeah.
oh, is that going to not be symmetric? Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and yes, it's mistake. It's actually artifact of like the entire situation with comments and description. Sometimes I confuse it from time to time. And finally, we remove it from GraphQL.js. So we remove, after I think like 2 or 3 years, we remove support for comment descriptions. So it should improve situation.
Yeah, that makes sense. The only thing with adding description strings on argument or on variable definitions is that it would be very easy to it'd be easy to screw up and confuse that for a default value. I'm not sure how big a concern that should actually be, but like it's unclear if it's hard to read like that the $ID :string is the default value is not switch for experiment. And I don't know how.
But I don't feel that strong for query variables. I still think it's nice for the same reason. especially like sometimes query variables. Like in a sense, maybe query variables are more important than operation, because operation at least, because sometimes, especially for skip include, you want to document what you're skipping and including. And we cannot change description format. It's already set.
For what it's worth, it's a pretty clear parallel to input definitions and argument definitions in the schema language, right? They have the exact same potential quirk with default values.
Yeah. So I'm not saying that should be a like blocker on this. It's just something we should know or whatever. That's the only reason I would find any roadblock, in fact, for this.
I'm also racking my brain trying to think of problems that this could introduce. I really like it. I think it's a really good idea. One thing that I thought of is in descriptions in the schema, those actually do have a concrete effect on the schema. Like you can pull them back down through introspection, for example, which can affect what gets done. I would imagine that with them in the operation like this, like a GraphQL minification library could just strip them out, just like it could with comments and with quite a lot of the white space. But I do wonder whether anyone might at some point try and leverage the fact that you can put extra detail there rather than doing so with a directive, for example, and cause problems. So I'm trying to think, do we need to prevent people from using this footgun? I honestly don't think it's a big deal, but it's literally the only problem I could come up with. So I think it's a really good idea and I think we should add it.
Yeah, to your point, I think there's a discussion on why did JSON add comments, and the original authors, like, they want to specifically prevent the behavior of relying on specific comment format to make things happen. Would the comment be, I guess it would be sent down to the server, right, to make that happen. So there is that footgun. But yeah, I don't have strong opinions either way, but it is in the wild, I think it makes some abuses.
Yeah, key importance here, it's like we have three mechanisms. We have comments, description, and directives. If person want to change server behavior, we have directives. Like in JSON, you don't have directives. So idea was not to allow you to do that. We already paid the price of allowing it. And like you can use /dash directive to screw up like caching or anything. So we already paid the price. Another thing, like people can use description to do client specific stuff. Like for example, I don't know, like you have validator in your project and you can use description to disable lint check on particular query, but for that you have comments. So like we already have mechanisms to do that, to abuse it, both like on the server and on the client. So I didn't like yet another mechanism that can be used for that. It's not changing situation.
I think the slight difference, Ivan, is that typically the comments would not be represented in the AST, right? Whereas the descriptions would be. So if you're looking at like your resolve info or whatever in GraphQL.js, for example, you could look at the AST nodes and actually pull in the description, whereas you wouldn't be able to do so with a comment because it's not attached to any particular node.
Yeah, on that point, there is issue on GraphQL.js to add comments into AST because people actually needed for that reason. They needed to to provide some stuff that is not description, like disable, like in USDL you want to disable validation and you don't want it to be part of documentation. So people already asking, and flow, IST for flow, and some ISTs for other languages include leading and trailing comments. So it's something that we need to implement. It just like nobody create PR already too much PR. I think it was some attempts to implement that. So
the basis for that is there because we were using it for the descriptions before we added the syntax for the SDL, right? So
I think we also wanted it, like we wanted it at Facebook because our build tooling uses GraphQL JS, and when we did transforms, we wanted to be able to print out the AST with the existing like comments not getting stripped. But
might we want to add a non-normative note that servers, it is expected that servers will treat both comments and descriptions as white space or like not meaningful.
Yeah, I totally agree with it. I think we should go even like even more powerful and say query with and without description is equivalent. So like description is not meaningful to a server and it's totally safe to strip them.
Go ahead and retrospectively say that about comments as well.
Agreed.
Yeah, and comments. Yeah, actually good idea. Yeah.
Just be a little careful. I think I totally agree with that. It wouldn't affect the query result, but it could affect the server. Like the server could do different translation of comments depending on what the comments are or something. I mean, it certainly sends them to introspection requests, but I just mean like it could, some server could do something with not your comments, your descriptions. But I think, I mean, if you're okay with saying the comment, the making the note saying that it shouldn't affect the query result, then I feel maybe that's what you already meant.
Shouldn't affect validation, execution, or response.
Right. Yeah. Right. All those.
Yeah. Yeah. But certainly the point being like you shouldn't like if you take out the descriptions, then the description's gone. So like if the server wanted to extract a description, then obviously deleting it would have some impact on that.
Just to clarify, since I will add this sentence, I will follow suggestion. Retrospectively, I will add comments in the mix. Without comments, it will feel weird to have. We strip description, but comments, yeah.
I like this. This is very aligned to one of the principles of GraphQL, it's documentation as the first class concept. So I think it's highly aligned. Subtle, but I can definitely see the use cases here.
So nobody opposed to moving it stage 1, and I will work for reference implementation next working group. I think we can do like move it stage by stage on every working group, so it will be pretty fast.
Agreed. Stage 1.
Yeah. So anything else before we switch to second topic?
Go for it.
Okay. So there is like 2 use cases and 1 solution. I had only 1 problem, and recently, 2 days ago, it was raised another issue. So I will start by not my proposal, non my use case. So Yakov from GraphQL 2, he's maintainer of GraphQL tools, and he contributed PR to GraphQL.js to allow you to return multiple errors from resolver, and he did all the implementation. I just was the concern that it's better to have errors, multiple errors having the same location or the same path. It's confusing and it's bad developer experience, and it's especially problematic. In his implementation, he used aggregated error, a new addition to ECMAScript, to JavaScript. And aggregated error allow you to provide list of errors, array of errors, and description. So basically, you have a grouping, and like you have some description attached to that grouping. So by just putting them flat in errors, we're creating multiple errors pointing to the same location, which is correct in current version of a spec. I just think it will be confusing for any tooling try to show it. I didn't try, but I expect like some of the tools like GraphQL don't handle it very well if you point to a couple errors in the one location. And second thing, you're using this grouping attribute. You don't understand that this error is one group, and you're using like common message. So motivation for this is the same as like for grouping errors in the first place. So basically, like if you do some kind of like parallel execution, or if you do like complex validation, when you cannot figure out what the primary validation criteria. So yeah, don't want to exit pages because we will see full screen. So let's error cause. Yeah, I initially link it. A big difference is that error cause is for chaining errors only. So you're not allowed to do wide. You can only go deep there, and that's why it's called cause. And I choose like why, because causes for me it sounded like strange. And I'm still not sure about the name. Name is under discussion. And second use case is like exactly as Lee pointed out. It's like for chaining. So right now in GraphQL.js, we return you error saying like particular scalar with particular name is receiving valid input, and we use semicolon to separate a message thrown by a scalar. We add that because usually message thrown here doesn't contain name of a scalar, or we can provide the name of query variable or some other information, and we basically lose this information. We need either concatenate or lose this information. So I dislike putting semicolon. It was my initial use case for that proposal, but I didn't thought it's like strong enough to motivate new change. But second use case is more appealing, even more appealing. And in JavaScript, since we already have aggregated errors, people added error cause as like second mechanism. I think we can do it with one field. Key difference of a Y field, why is different? is it's not recursive. So inside array, it's not errors. It's like simplified errors. My proposal is to limit them to only message and extension for now. Maybe later we figure out something else we need there, but it would be weird if we have error pointing to particular location and sub errors pointing to different location. Another thing, why it's not errors, because errors implies recursive. I feel it's hard to provide good developer experience or good UI if you want to present with error to user, if you have like recursive, if you can have like long chain. So basically it's limited to one layer. Yeah, I think it's a little bit harder than description, but also pretty simple proposal. One thing, I'm the same as previously. I'm like totally okay with by shading about name and like there's some restriction. I just want to discuss like general use cases and usability of this feature.
This definitely seems pretty useful to me. I've seen a bunch of cases where we like pull the error messages together and sum them up to try to make a meaningful error message. So being able to offer chained out or aggregated messages seems pretty useful. Do you see this being potentially recursive? Like could the error cause proposal in JavaScript allows you to chain those out? Like would you have an error that's has a Y of another error, which has a Y of another error?
I think it more like first use case for chaining is coming from my own experience with GraphQL.js. Usually in GraphQL.js we have like wrapping error with as much content. Like for me, if you returning something between boundaries, you need to try as much as possible to put a small context and one string, and like just chain random stuff being lazy. You put all the effort to figure out what to happen on a client. So for me, you need to like try. But what happened in GraphQL.js, we have like error from GraphQL.js itself and error from client code. So there is no way to present both without concatenation. So I'm with this proposal, I'm solving that issue. And I think clients should try as much as possible to also do their own like concatenation joining. And in future, if people present, we can allow like some chaining. But one thing I'm totally against is to what problem of cause is it's a chain to error. So a chain to something that can have the same attributes. I'm like, if we have location, it should be location only on top level. If we have path for error inside the resolver, we should have like it only on top level. So in future, I'm okay if like somebody come with use case to allow to deeper chaining. I'm just think it should be like simplified errors or like Y causes or like something else that recursive.
Just as a slight challenge to what you've just said, Ivan, in the situation where you say that a bunch of fields on a type are non-nullable, and then say all of them or like 3 of them come through as null, that would be represented, I think, I can't quite remember, that's represented as an error on the field that ultimately becomes the null placeholder, right? The shorter path length, I think. So we say in the message which field it was, but I don't think the path itself does. Is that correct?
Can you type in the chat? It's hard to like.
Sure.
Yeah.
Benji, I think it is the original source of error. Location, both location and path should give you the path all the way in, which might go past where a null was if it was caught along the way. So it tells you the source of the error, not where it was caught.
Okay, so that wouldn't, yeah, that's fine then. Cool, good.
But it's a good point because, yeah.
My use case was like in graphical, we have red squarely line underneath something, and it's confusing to have multiple things there. So even if there is like use case for doing stuff like that, it's like confusing how you visualize it in stuff like graphical or ID or something else.
I see utility in this. It's like clearly useful. I'm wondering about the GraphQL principle of simplicity for the end user. Is it just making it more complicated than it needs to be? Or like you just mentioned about the different ways you can combine it into a single string, but choosing on the server means that everybody's getting consistent behavior instead of different clients getting different behaviors. Or if I take this and I get this error message, and in my client or in middleware, I turn it into a log message. If it's just a string, it's easier to, I need a more consistent behavior of how I present that to different users. So I'm not objecting, but I'm trying to figure out, would it cause problems in how people see the errors on the other side?
Yeah, I can provide
go ahead, sorry.
feedback on that. We have like build schema function, and it's accept SDL, and it's produce error, and this error contain new line. So it contains bunch of new lines, and it's very hard to read. So it's contradict like developer experience thing. My main concern here, it's like if we do long string, what we do right now, long string with semicolons, for example, or new lines, it's hard. Usually it's represented as a string in JSON or like another format, as we discussed, like we're not titled JSON, like XML or anything. For a person, it's not markdown, it's not formatted. And it's hard for a person to read if it's sufficiently long. And plus escape, representing new lines as escape sequences, it's also hard readability.
It makes sense to me that, because I definitely hear the point of, making something most reasonable. And this shouldn't be a crutch to make the rolled up message less useful. But especially when it comes to reporting errors, having as much information as possible seems like it's always a good thing. And especially if the puck is going in the direction of error chains and aggregate errors and all these other ways in the actual programming language ecosystem to model the complexities that raise errors, then us being able to serialize those back down seems like a very useful debugging tool. So I think this is a smart idea. I especially like that we could potentially like merge the two concepts into one behavior as a simplifying force.
I like your point of just being consistent with the environments we're in is pretty strong.
Yeah, and on positive note, it's a first field we added to errors after we introduced extensions. So our long-term investment in enforcing everybody to use extension is paid off. And now we can add like stuff on errors that shouldn't conflict with any vendor specific stuff.
Awesome. Well, this I think is worthy of stage 1. Seems compelling. I'd be very curious to see if there's some like out of the box value that we get. Like if you start working on the GraphQL.js side pull request and have some examples that exemplify this, that'll really help us understand the kind of value that we're going to get and tweak from there. But yeah, this is great. Thanks for your work on this, Yvonne. That is the last agenda item we have, and it literally just rolled over to the hour. So holy crap, we did it. We got through the entire agenda in exactly the time allotted. I don't know how we did that, like literally down to the second. I'm impressed.
Congrats,
all
everyone.
Right. This is the most efficiently and effectively run meeting I've been in all week.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody. This has been a pleasure. Very excited to see all the ongoing work. Very much appreciate everybody's energy and work between the meetings. It shows we're moving forward on a lot of things at once. It's really great to see. So thank you all, and I'll see you all again next month.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.